So it's been my privilege to work on this project. Now it's been 8 years. We started back in 2012, and we're getting ready to start phase 2 of the project. And towards the end of the talk, I'll give you some details about what we're going to be doing with phase 2. So we're just wrapping up phase 1, writing papers right now. So a lot of what I'll show you in today's presentation is what we know about the forest up to date now. So you'll see some new things that you may not have seen or heard about yet about the research we're doing out on the shelf. So for those of you who haven't heard about the Alabama forest, this is our study site. Oops, let me see. And it's offshore, so about 10 miles offshore and about 60 foot of water. And it's not a location that you would expect to find trees. And that's what makes it such a fascinating project to work on. So what we're going to see, I'm going to take you diving, but before we go diving virtually, I want to just orient you to what you're going to see underwater. So the trees that we have out at the underwater forest are bald cypress trees. And these are trees that we have all throughout the Gulf Coast. The map here in green just shows you the distribution of where these trees live. So they're an iconic species here in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, and then also going up into the Carolinas and Georgia. But we also have bald cypress not just along the coastlines, they also occur going up the Mississippi River Valley, all the way up to Illinois and Indiana. We also find them in Texas in some higher locations. But in general, these trees like to grow at elevations of 150 feet above sea level. They do occur at some higher elevations, but generally at those lower elevations in places where there's lots of water. We find them close to rivers. We find them in our backwater swamps. And this is how most people know of bald cypress, is these are the trees that are growing in the backwater swamps. And for Louisiana, it's crawfish season right now. So if you go out crawfishing, you know your bald cypress trees because they're in those environments where we have our crawfish. So what we're going to see when we go underwater is the trees are no longer alive, they're long dead. And what we're going to see is just the stumps. So I put up this red line so you can see about if we were to go through, cut down the tree, we would see a stump. The bottom of a bald cypress tree has this buttress structure. It has this really unique shape. So kind of like this table here that was made from the base of a bald cypress tree. So it's kind of this iconic shape. And when you see that shape underwater, you know exactly what you're looking at, that you're looking at a bald cypress. So I'm going to start the video here and we'll go diving. And you can see here on the seafloor, the stumps, and they're pretty much all over the place. There's lots of sand. So some of the stumps are smaller, some of them are larger. So where we're diving at right now is not in the divot that's in the seafloor, but right next to it, where you can see some of these stumps are exposed. And once you get down into the depression, there's even more stumps there, larger stumps, and that ledge is starting to erode and exposing more wood. And if you just look out into the background, you just see stumps, stumps, and more stumps all over the place. All right, so that's what it looks like diving. And I'll show you some still images. So here is one of those stumps in the background. And then me and one of my former graduate students diving the site. And then this is doing some coring work underwater. So normally we core trees on land using our increment bore. So I haven't come across too many people who've bored into a tree underwater, but here's a snapshot of me doing that. And this core that we collected out of this tree, we're actually going to use that for radiocarbon dating later. And you'll notice that the wood is all covered in sea anemones. and they'll sting your hands a little bit. So the wood has been colonized by marine organisms, and there's lots of things growing down there. So there's shrimp, there's lots of fish, there's a little turtle that lives out at the site. So when we go out there in the boat, when we get close, we see our turtle coming up to breathe, we know that we're on the forest site. And then here's another picture of one of these stumps that's in the depression that's at the site where we have our great exposure. And you can see this pretty large stump. And then in Ben Raines' documentary, this is one of the still grabs from that work of the dive team bringing up one of these large stumps from the seafloor up to the surface. Oops, sorry. So one of the questions that comes to mind when we start working on this project is wood is not something you typically find out in the ocean. And that's because you have different organisms in the ocean that will colonize wood and start to erode it. So like here's a picture of this wood piling and you see all these holes in it. And that's due to shipworms and other organisms in the ocean that will start to eat the wood, and eventually the wood will just disintegrate and it's no longer present. So we don't expect to find wood out in the ocean. So it must have been buried at some point and then something happened to uncover it. The other question we have is, why is this wood so well preserved? And we want to know how old it is. And these are important questions that we want to answer in our research. So let me show you where the site is. So just to orient you, this is a map of the northern Gulf Coast. So I've got a picture of North America here just to orient you. The larger map is inside this square box. The site is the red box. So it's located in 60 feet of water. So it's about 10-ish miles offshore. And what I've got here, in the gray area, this is showing you the depth of the ocean. So what we have when we go offshore is this continental shelf that's quite wide along the Gulf Coast, and this continental shelf has lots of sediments on it, and those sediments tend to be these ridges of sand and troughs, and they tend to go from the northwest to the southeast. Now, if we were to look through those sediments into the hard substrate beneath that, these white contour lines are showing us what's underneath those sediments. And these contour lines show us what looks like what if could have been a river valleys in the past. And if you look over here to DeSoto Canyon, you'll notice there's this deep canyon that goes out into the abyssal plain of the Gulf of Mexico. And this is also one of these canyons that's formed by rivers when sea level's lower, that gets carved out as rivers dump their sediment into the deep ocean. So looking beneath all of this sand, we see what looks like a buried river channel system. And our site is located towards the northern end of this, not right along the river, but back where there would have been some bayous and creeks typical to what you see today inland if you go into the Atchafalaya Basin here in Louisiana, or going upriver the Pascagoula in Mississippi, or going up the Mobile Tensas River system, you would find these types of bald cypress backwater swamps. So we can see that the site is located in what looks like could have been a buried river system. So how did this buried river system get there? So for this, we have to go back in time. And here I'm taking you back to a period called the last glacial maximum that happened 18,000 years ago. And during this time, sea level dropped by 410 feet. And when this happens, all of that continental shelf becomes exposed. And here you can see the state of Florida. And when sea level drops, the state of Florida is almost twice as wide as it is today. And then I put a red star here just to show about the location of where the underwater forest would have been located during the last glacial maximum. So you can see that it's inland quite a ways, and this is what we would expect to see for a bald cypress forest that's growing along the coast today, similar conditions. However, during the last glacial maximum, this was the ice age, and it's really cold. we have this 2 mile thick ice sheet that's formed over North America. So we want to know something about what was climate like during these time periods in the past, because bald cypress are trees that don't tolerate a whole lot of really cold temperatures. So it kind of gives us this view into the past of, if we have bald cypress trees that are alive when sea level is lower, what can that tell us about climate? Was it very different from today, or was it similar? So just to kind of give you a view of what happens during a glacial interglacial cycle. So I'm going to take you back further in time to a period 120,000 years ago, and that's called the last interglacial. And this was the last time the Earth was in a warm period similar to today. And this white graph that I've put up here at the top, this is showing you sea level changes as we go through time. So we're going to start over here at the top of this sea level curve, so 120,000 years ago, which is the same as today. And I'm going to start the animation, and we're going to see what happens to North America as we start to go through the ice ages. You'll see sea level will drop as we go through. It's not a continuous drop, it pulses, it increases and decreases, and you'll see why as we start watching the ice sheets forming. So the clock up here at the top will tell you where we are in time. So we're moving forward, the ice sheets are getting bigger, and sea level is dropping. Initially, those ice sheets are not very thick. They're going to get thicker through time, but you'll see that they grow and then they melt back. And as they melt back, sea level increases, and then they'll grow again, sea level will drop, and then they will melt back and sea level will increase. And then we're going to go into this really rapid thickening of the ice sheet, and we get our biggest drop so far when we get to about 60,000 years ago, and then they melt back again. And you just see this pulses of the ice sheets building and getting smaller. So if you look back here in the background, you can actually see sea levels dropped and Alaska is connected to Asia, so the Bering Land Bridge is open. You'll also notice Greenland stays glaciated during this time. And if you look over here to the far right, you'll see the ice sheets forming over Northern Europe and parts of Asia. So you can see that throughout the ice ages that sea level is varying, is going up and down as these ice sheets get larger and melt back, larger and melt back. And this is the environment that the underwater forest is growing in. So coming back to this question of how do you get wood preserved from an ice age still buried in the sediments offshore. So here I'm just showing some pictures all cutting out pieces from the middle of the wood. The wood is really nicely preserved. You can see here after we cut it, it still looks brown inside. Oops, sorry, I just got a message that my internet was unstable. I'll make sure we're back working again. Okay, so here you can see right after the wood was brought up and we cut it, that it's still nice and brown inside. And like this piece that Grant's holding, you can see that the bark is still on the outside, and quite a few pieces that we recovered still had bark. The bottom two pictures here are interesting. These are not bald cypress. This is actually a palm tree. But how do you get wood to be preserved in the sediments? So what you need is to have little oxygen in those sediments. So the bacteria don't have any oxygen that they need to survive. So if you don't have bacteria and other organisms in the sediments, then the wood will stay preserved and it does not decompose. And these type of conditions typically happen in our backwater swamps. And that's because that water is still, it doesn't move. You get a flood of it that comes in, fills that depression in with water, and the water just sits. Whatever's in the water will use up the oxygen that's in the water. Then there's no more oxygen, there's no mixing, so the sediments in that backwater swamp will not have a lot of oxygen in them, and anything that falls into those sediments can be preserved. The other thing you need to do is bury the wood quickly, and you need there to be no erosion through time so that that wood is not exposed to the elements where it could be eroded. So we do know that wood has been preserved in the past. So this is a photo from one of my colleagues here at LSU and the Louisiana Geological Society of some bald cypress stumps that were found when they were doing a road construction project just south of campus. You can see this is a pretty large stump, and you can see where they've cut it some, and that wood still looks very modern. It doesn't look, it's still got that yellow color to it, like it was freshly cut wood. If you look in the very background here, you can see a whole bunch of more stumps in the background. So this particular stump was dated, and it's about 4,000 years old. So this tree was living here on the edge of the Mississippi River. The river probably moved, and the site got flooded with sediments, and the trees were buried and preserved. So Paul has come up with a hypothesis for how these particular bald cypress trees were preserved. So here we have a cross section of the Mississippi River, and you can see over here on the right-hand side, we get these point bars that set up with depressions. And this has our backwater swamps with bald cypress trees, an environment for them to grow. But then you get a flooding event that comes in and adds sediment to the site and starts to bury that wood. And then over time, you get more and more sediment burying the trees, and then the trees are preserved in those anoxic sediments. So that's how you would, one way you could preserve wood. And what we're going to do with the Alabama Forest Project is look to see what are those conditions that allowed for this wood to be preserved. So some of the work we've done is we've gone out and collected sediment cores. So here's the team going out on the LSU's coastal profiler. So it's one of our converted shrimp boats that we use for doing research. The core is this large metal stand here. It has a vibrating top, and as this vibrates, the core will sink down into the sand, and it actually happens very quickly. It takes about a minute for that core to go all the way through the sediment. So it's about a 10-foot long core. And we did this work in 2015 and 2016. In 2015, pretty much every core we collected, we hit a tree and had wood in the very bottom of those cores. And then here's a picture of one of those core bottoms. So again, when you're working out in the ocean, you don't expect to find these organic, rich, peaty sediments. You expect to find sand, but we're finding what we find in a swamp inland. And in this close-up, you can actually see little pieces of roots and stem, and then there's a little piece of wood over here. So this is really exciting for us to do this coring at this site and find terrestrial swamp sediments offshore. So this is a map from our geophysical work that we've been doing at the site to give you a view of what it looks like. So I put a red star here right next to the depression in the seafloor where the stumps are being exposed. That red star is next to one of the really large stumps close to where we were swimming in the diving video. So here you can see the sand ridge that's just to the east of the site, and then you go into one of these troughs, and then you have the depression here. So what we're thinking, what happened for these trees to be exposed is when Hurricane Ivan came through in 2004, that particular hurricane was really strong offshore. It was a Category 5 and was producing some very strong or very high waves. And NOAA had reported several of their buoys had significant scour on the bottom of those buoy platforms during Hurricane Ivan. So we're thinking that the site was exposed by Hurricane Ivan, and it was shortly found by fishermen after Ivan came through. So we're interested in knowing, you know, these particularly strong storms like Hurricane Ivan, you know, could they have exposed other sites on the continental shelf? And it's one of the questions that I've been interested in as we do this research. But this gives you an idea of what the seafloor looks like where the trees are exposed. So here we're looking at some side scan sonar images going through the site. And so this one to the left is a larger image. The purple box is blown up over here to the right. And then I've highlighted here more purple boxes, actual tree contacts that we can see in the side scan sonar. So the trees that are exposed on the surface, we can see those with our side scan sonar. And we were able to go a little bit down into the sand to see where there's potentially trees still buried. But we know from our coring work that there are more trees out there buried because we're hitting them with our coring system. But our side scan sonar and our other geophysical systems that we're using right now are not able to fully resolve all of these buried trees that are still out there. But we're pretty sure there's quite a bit more. So I'm going to take a look at a core in a little more detail. It's our longest core that we've collected so far. It's almost 5 meters. And it's in this location right between the trough and the sand ridge. So we're going to take a look at that core in more detail. So these are just some core images from that core DF15. So the top two, or these two left ones are the full core. So going from the top through all of this sand. So there's about 3 meters of sand, about 9 foot of sand. And then we go into a section in the core where we get sand and mud, and then the bottom meter or so, we get into those organic rich peats and mud. This image here to the right is just a zoomed in version of the bottom of this core. So one of the first things we wanted to do with this project is figure out how old the wood was. So a lot of that wood that we collected diving, that core that I took underwater, and then some of the wood we collected from the cores, we sent that off to get radiocarbon dated. Pretty much all the wood came back with infinite ages. So that's what this greater than 43,000 years means. It means that the trees are so old, there's not enough radiocarbon left in them to date them. So this tells us that our site is pretty old. We also went in and collected some organic debris and some of those roots and organic particles, woody debris in the cores. We sent that off to get dated. So here at about 4.05 centimeters down core, we were able to get one radiocarbon date that came back, it was almost 42,000 years ago. And then a second date that was collected at 4.15 centimeters, we got another date of 350 years old. So this is younger than the one above it. So we sent it off to get dated again. And the second time we dated it, it came back with one of those infinite. What's happening is we're so close to the detection limits for radiocarbon dating. It's really hard to get a good radiocarbon date. There's just not enough carbon-14 left in the sediments or the wood to do good dates. So this led us to do a different type of dating. So we started to use optically stimulated luminescence dating. And what this does is it looks at the sand and the sediments and when was the last time those sediments were exposed to sunlight. And using this type of dating technique, we were able to determine from looking at several of our cores that we have dates ranging from 74 to 56,000 years ago for the site. So this pushes us back a little further on our global sea level curve. So that's our red dates here, that we're looking at the earlier part of the last ice age when these trees were alive. So the green dates are the radiocarbon and the red are the OSL dates. We also, looking at the sediment cores, we're pretty sure all the sand is from the last 10,000 years or the Holocene, but then we get this jump to ice age dates within just a meter of the core. So this tells us somewhere in our core we have an erosional surface or disconformity. So we wanted to know where this erosional surface is located in the cores because that helps us reconstruct what happened to this site and how it's evolved through time. And that was a question one of my master students worked on. So what we were looking at is with all of our different sediment cores, we wanted to come in and understand the sequence of what's happening with the sediments, what types of sediments are occurring, so we can go in and build an environmental reconstruction of this site. So what we have is 5 different types of sediments in all of our sediment cores. So we've already talked about the Holocene sands, the sands and muds, and then this interbedded peat and mud layer. But what we find as we go further to the east is we get more mud and sands, and the peat layers start to disappear for these cores located on the other side of the sand ridge. And then really interesting is these cores here to the farthest east, we start to get these clayey sediments that have traces of oxidation in it. And that means they've been exposed to the air sometime in the past. We call these paleosols. So these sediments are just as old as all of our peat layers, but these sediments were exposed to air. So this tells us that this was probably at a higher elevation when the peats and the trees were growing over here in the depression to the west. So using different types of sediments, we could start to understand what this landscape looked like in the past. So we can also go in and look at chirp data to see what's going on beneath the sediments. And in here we can start to look at comparing our cores and the types of sediments to what we're seeing with the chirp. We can start to build up what these layers look like underneath the sea floor, where we have sand, where we have mud and peat, and where we have these interbedded sands. And then the surface that is older beneath all of that. So coming back to where we have that erosional surface, so what my student looked at was the shells of these little benthic animals that live on the seafloor. And these typically grow in marine environments and into estuaries where you still have some salt water. But once you start getting into fresh water, you don't find these types of animals living anymore. So JT went through the sediment core, through these sand sections, and sieve the different sediments to find these little shells that were left over, and then went through and identified them by species. And by looking at the species, it tells us something about the environment in the past. So we can see that we have what's a marine environment till we get to about 3.8 meters down core. So we know that this is all modern marine. And then if I put in the radiocarbon date that we got from the foraminifera, so this gives us a date of about 4,000 years ago. So we know we've got Holocene sands to about 4,000 years ago, and then below that, we start to lose the foram. So we know we've got that erosional surface somewhere between our 3.8 and our date that was here at 3.4. So we're starting to understand what's happening inside the core. And here's the location of that, of the bottom of where we have all of the forams. So beneath this 3.8 or 3.8 meter mark, we don't have any more indications of a marine environment. So we know our erosional surface is somewhere between 3.8 and 4 meters down core. The other thing we looked at as we go deeper into the core, so down into these peat sediments, is looking at pollen. So my colleague at University of Southern Mississippi looked at the pollen, and so looking at going down core to see if pollen was present, and we don't get a whole lot of pollen until we get down here into the peaty sediments. And here's just some microscopic images of the different types of pollen that was found. So tupelo, bald cypress, and pine trees. So this diagram shows you those pollen results, and I'm going to walk you through this from the bottom up. So here from the bottom of the core to about 4.55 meters, what we find is a lot of pollen that's similar to what we see today in our modern swamps. So the tupelo, the bald cypress, those pine trees. Now, as we go up the core, we're moving forward in time. What we see is this transition to a more open forest with grass. So if you think about moving from a bald cypress swamp that's inland, so as we get to grass and more open forests, we're starting to move closer to open ocean. The next assemblage we see is this bar levee formation. So these happen on sandbars really close to the coast. So you can almost imagine these out on barrier islands. This particular pollen assemblage is really interesting because we don't have this on the Gulf Coast. The only place you can find this today is up here in North Carolina. And this is particularly interesting because that means the trees and the plants that were living at this particular interval in the sediment core were experiencing climate conditions similar to North Carolina today, back when these trees were alive during the last ice age. So then as we move up to about 4 meters in the core, so we're getting close to that erosional edge in the sediment core, all of the pollen shifts over to grass. So this is like being really close to the estuaries and the barrier islands and getting closer to marine environments. You don't find any more trees once you start to move upwards in the core. So we can almost see this shift in sea level and also a shift in what's happening with our plant communities as sea levels changing through the core as we move through time. And then above this grass layer, everything turns into Holocene, so last 10,000 years, marine sediments. All right, so another thing we found in those peats and muds in the bottom of the cores are seeds. And this is really interesting that we have seeds that are over 50,000 years old. So we find bald cypress seeds, sweet gum, button bush, rose mallow. So this is all just indications, again, of the great preservation that we have in these peat sediments that have been preserved. And we're going to be doing more work with the seeds as we move into phase 2 of the project. So kind of pulling everything together with our sediment cores. So I'll just pull the modern bathymetry back up, and then where these cores that we're going to look at are located as we go across from east to west. So you can see in each of these cores, the sand at the top, and then you go into these peat sediments towards the bottom. So that paleosol is over here to the easternmost section. So this was a landform that was exposed. So we're starting to think that this was a levee or sand deposits with a lot of flood sediments that was bringing in clay that was exposed when the trees were alive, because these are from the OSL dating, this sediments from the paleosols are at the same age as what we have with our trees and our peats that are to the west. So you can almost draw a line of where this erosional surface look like. But to make this a little easier, we're going to go in and build a 3D model of what the site looked like. So this top layer is showing us the modern surface. This layer in between is that erosional or transgressive surface. And then the bottom would be the hard last interglacial surface below that. So we can see that we have what looks like some sort of natural levee here to the east, and then a depression that would have been a backwater swamp where the bald cypress trees were living, and those sediments collected and were preserved. So looking at these different surfaces, we can start to see, you know, these depressions, particularly this depression here. This difference here is almost 9 meters. So this tells us that we've potentially got about 8 more meters of peat out there that we can investigate, and we've only got the first meter so far. So this is something we're interested in looking at, is can we go deeper with our cores and look at this whole interval where the trees were alive. So wanted just to kind of go over what we got out of the tree ring results. So my colleague Grant Harley here is looking at one of the pieces we collected diving, and he investigates the rings inside the trees to try to understand what the climate environment of the trees was when they were alive. One of the first things we noticed looking at these particular pieces of cypress was that the rings are really tight. So this tells us that the trees were growing in an environment that was more stressful than today, because modern bald cypress do not have rings as close together. So one of the things Grant has put together is a floating chronology of all of these tree rings. And what dendrochronologists do is they look at the patterns in the trees and they can match them up. So it's like barcodes in the trees, and they move them back and forth to match them up in time. And with this, they can start to look at what is the common changes that happen in all of the trees. And if it's happening in all the trees, we can infer that that is something that's happening with climate or the environment. So this graph shows this tree ring chronology that spans almost 500 years. The gray shaded area shows us how many trees were included in that chronology. So the longest chronology we got was almost 500 years, but that was just one tree. And then we can add a second tree to it, and then a third, and so on. As we get more trees, we become more confident in what the sequence is telling us. So I'm going to start right here about 300 years to look at what's happening to the environment, because all of the trees are seeing this signal. Oops, sorry. So what we see is the trees are going through periods of stress where they start growing less, and then they increase their growth, and then that growth becomes reduced again. And we get this quite large stress event that happens about 430 years into the chronology. And then there's a recovery that happens where the trees start to grow again. But again, you get this periodic stress events that are happening. And then all of the trees pretty much die at the same time. And we have the bark on a lot of these sequences that we dated. So we know that these trees were not standing for a long time after they died, because bark will come off of a snag very quickly if it's left standing. A tree can stand for a number of years after it dies, but that bark is quickly shed. So having the bark on this wood tells us that the trees were buried quickly when they died. So this is all very interesting to tell us about what's happening in the environment when the trees were alive. So we know it's stressful. It's probably getting a little colder than they like, and precipitation could be changing as well. So if we come in and look at our chronology from offshore and compare it to other bald cypress chronologies that are modern, what we find is this chronology with its really small rings looks a lot like chronologies up the Mississippi River Valley, so quite a bit further north than where our trees are located, and then also these trees that are inland in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So again, from this we can infer when the bald cypress trees were alive at our site offshore, their environmental conditions were similar to what was happening today, up here in Arkansas and Tennessee, or over here in the Carolinas. So, and we know from just traveling around that these places have a similar climate to what we have today, but they tend to get colder in the winter, but their summers tend to be very similar to ours. So we know that these trees will probably experience a little bit more cold stress than what our trees do today. All right, so kind of moving through, putting all of this evidence together, we can build what we think happened to the forest as we go through time. So I'm going to start going back here about 70,000 years ago. As the forest is alive, the continental shelf is exposed. So we have the lanyap deltas forming, and we also have these river valleys that are forming. So the forest is quite a bit ways inland, and probably growing in one of these backwater swamps from what we can tell from our geophysical data. So then the trees are buried, and what our hypothesis is right now is that we got one of these rapid sea level pulses that occurred as the ice sheets were melting. And as sea level rises, this causes the river to start moving inland, and you get this floodplain aggregation and burial events that can happen from sea level rise. So that's one of our hypotheses for what buried the forest, was this rapid pulse and sea level rise. So as we move to the last glacial maximum, so this is the lowest that sea level is going to be during the last ice age, our trees are still inland, and they're buried. And we do have rivers that are forming and deltas, but there's enough sediment over these trees that they're going to stay buried and not be eroded away throughout the last glacial maximum. So coming out of the last glacial maximum and into the deglacial, sea level is going to rise. All of these river systems are going to move inland, and we're going to get this system of interbedded sands and muds at our forest site that we see in our sediment cores. And then we move to modern, where we're in open marine conditions today. So this kind of gives you a view of what we think happened to the site going through time. So what we're going to do with phase 2 that we'll be starting as soon as we get out of coronavirus quarantines is we're bringing in a 3D chirp system from the UK. And this will be the first time this type of technology has been used in the Gulf of Mexico. They use this in Europe quite a bit to look for shipwrecks that are buried and also for mines from World War II. So we're going to use this to image the wood and the stumps that are still buried. So we're excited about bringing that, this instrumentation into the Gulf to do research. We're also going to take out the point SUR with a larger coring system. So we're going to use a vibra coring system that's 10 meters long with the goal of getting through all of those, that 8 and 9 meters of peat that we see in our digital model for the sediments, and we're hoping to get all the way back to the last interglacial with these deeper cores in phase 2. We'll also be investigating pollen. We'll do more work with seeds as well. Another side project that's been going on that was highlighted in the New York Times last month was a group out of Northeastern University is looking at shipworms in the wood. So they contacted me about the underwater forest after seeing a story on the news, and they were very interested in if we had unique shipworms that were colonizing this wood that was on the Gulf Coast. So they went out in December and did some collections, and they brought back some wood and have been looking at the shipworms in that wood. I'm particularly interested in the shipworm work because we think Hurricane Ivan uncovered the forest. But if you think about how long the forest has been in the marine environment, it could have been as much as 10,000 to 15,000 years. And I'm interested in knowing, has this wood ever been exposed in that past 10,000 to 15,000 years? Because you start to think about really strong hurricanes like Hurricane Ivan, and if this wood has never been exposed in the past 10 to 15,000 years, that means we haven't had hurricanes as strong as Ivan coming through. And I think it's a really interesting research question to think about is, is these strong hurricanes that we're seeing here in the last 20 to 30 years, is this been happening pretty regularly? So that's a question we want to tackle with shipworms. And with shipworms, they put down tubes that are calcium carbonate. And because there's carbon in there, I can radiocarbon date those. And they're not as old as the wood, so we should be able to get back good radiocarbon dates that would tell us if that wood's been exposed in the past. So that's kind of the latest that's been happening. And there's a little shot of what those shipworms look like in their tubes. So here's just some fun photos from us doing our field work. We've had a lot of great students working with us on the project, researchers from University of Southern Mississippi, University of Idaho, and LSU. And there's a shot of Ben. And so this is a team that we've been working on the project. So there's lots of different people involved. I'm always looking for people who have good research questions and want to work on this site because it's so unique and there's so much that can be done with this unique underwater forest off the coast of Alabama. So I'll end it there with a shot from, this is the Peace River. This was 2017 in December when we had that snow event come through. And I just love this photo because to me, this is what the Ice Age forest probably looked like when the trees were alive.
Well, Kristine, thank you so much. We do have a little bit of time for questions if people want to put them in the chat. Hannah did ask, how do you do radiocarbon dating to tell how old it is?
Right. So with radiocarbon dating, we use an instrument called an accelerator mass spectrometer. It's a large instrument that would be the size of almost a basketball court. And what we're doing is counting very small amounts of radiocarbon, so it's carbon-14. And this radioactive carbon has a half-life of about 5,200 years. So as that radiocarbon decays, you're losing half of it with each half-life. Eventually, all the radiocarbon disappears and there's nothing left to count. So what you do is you look at how much radiocarbon is in the sample, and how much is left will tell you how old that particular sample is.
Does anyone else have any questions for Kristine? What's the oldest water tree?
So the oldest tree that's in water, or okay. There are older trees that have been found. And of course we have petrified wood. So like over in Mississippi, they've got some really nice petrified wood over there that's 36 million years old. So if you're out wanting to find a cool place to go do a field trip, the Mississippi Petrified Forest, which is really close to Vicksburg, is a really nice place to go. And they have a really nice museum. So there is wood out there that's quite old and it's petrified. So our wood is still wood. When you cut it, it smells like freshly cut wood. So it hasn't gone through that change to become rock. There have been other people who have found wood that's been buried down in New Zealand. There's also sites in Wales where they have tree stumps that have been preserved. You may have heard of the bog mummies that they have in Wales and Scotland. Again, these are sites that are about 10,000 years old where you do get preservation. Some of the permafrost up in the Arctic, you can find wood that's still preserved there. So it does happen. You have to find particular locations that allow the wood to be preserved. So no oxygen, no bacteria, nothing there to decompose the wood. So it can happen, but it is rare. And one of the things we're trying to figure out is what are those conditions out on the continental shelf where we have these depressions that were backwater swamps during the Ice Age where wood could be preserved. So one of the things we're doing in phase 2 is pulling a lot of geophysical data and looking at what's below the sediments to try to predict where other locations could be where wood is preserved. So we have one site that some researchers at Southern Miss have found wood in their sediment cores that's actually just south of Dolphin Island. So we're going to be going out and investigating that site and doing coring work there. The trees there are not exposed, they're still buried. So we're going to see if we can see them with our 3D chirp system. We also have another site offshore of Alabama that we'll be going out to investigate in phase 2 where the wood is exposed. And then over in Florida, just south of Mexico Beach, there's a site that was uncovered by Hurricane Michael back in 2018. I'm trying to remember, 2018, 2019. So there are other sites out there, and we kind of think there might be this bathtub ring of trees around the Gulf of Mexico that is still buried. And then after that New York Times article came out, I got an email from a guy at the Smithsonian Institute who sent me some pictures of trees they have in the Chesapeake Bay that they found that are also bald cypress trees. And these trees go back 10 million years, if I remember correctly. So they're predating the Ice Age. So there is other wood out there, but it's not common. It tends to be rarer. So long answer there.
So Kristine, Thomas and Ruth Carmichael want to know if Hurricane Katrina also contributed to exposing the remnant forest, or was it just Ivan?
Right. Good question.
Different effects.
Right. So Hurricane Ivan was in 2004. Hurricane Katrina was in 2005. So the trees were already exposed in 2004. So Katrina, again, is a strong storm. It was a Cat 3, had quite a bit of large storm surge. So it is possible that Katrina could have impacted this site, but it was already exposed from what we know. So what we're thinking is that probably the eye of the hurricane has got to be pretty close to the site where the waves are going to be the largest, to cause this type of erosion to occur. So again, it's something that I'm interested in, and I'm talking to different researchers about how do we do the modeling to figure out how strong a hurricane has to be. What is that type of hurricane? What are those characteristics to cause this much erosion on the seafloor at 60 feet? And this is pretty deep. Like as you go inshore, yes, you get a lot of erosion that can happen from hurricanes, but in deeper waters, you typically don't expect this to happen. So just like coral reefs, hurricanes go over coral reefs, they do cause some damage to larger hurricanes. But for the most part, reefs are not greatly impacted or damaged structurally by hurricanes. So it has to be the really strong hurricanes for that kind of damage to happen.
And Mike Langston, he expands on that and asks, if there have other hurricanes as strong as Ivan, wouldn't the water depth at the time of the storm also be a factor and not just the storm strength?
So water depth being shallower or being deeper? Yeah, and that's one of the things, like with hurricanes, you do get a bulge that occurs really close to where the eye is, and that's because of the low pressure where the water will actually come up. But then you have the waves that are being generated by the winds. You do get some undercurrents that happen. Another interesting thing that happens with hurricanes is hurricanes actually pump cold water up from the deep ocean. So you kind of get a cold water wake that happens behind a hurricane, particularly the large, strong hurricanes. So yes, there's a lot of interesting things that happen with hurricanes. And I think they're really interesting research questions for people to work on.
Well, Kristine, we are just a few minutes. Hannah says, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And is there anything last minute? We really appreciate you joining us from LSU to share this chat with everybody, and we appreciate everybody who hopped on today. We do have it archived for future watching references that we'll put on our YouTube channel and our website. So take one more look. The last question that Mike Langston had is, and I just lost it. Why are there only the stumps?
Right. So as the trees get the sediments going to decompose and not be present anymore. So it's only the part of the trees that were in the sediments. Now, we talk about the stumps, and that's mostly what we see on the seafloor, but there are logs. So the group that went out doing the shipworm work, they actually brought up a log that was about 4 foot long. So there are logs out there. We do have pieces of tree limbs and roots that we've brought up. So it's not just the stumps. There are other pieces of the trees that are out there and preserved. But if you think about a forest today, as the trees are alive, you have branches that die, they'll fall off. The trees will die, eventually they fall over. So if that log goes into the mud, it can be preserved. But mostly what we're seeing out there is stumps.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kristine. We appreciate it. Thank you, everybody,
Thanks
for joining us. And so
everyone.
with that, we say goodbye and maybe till next time.
Yes. Hopefully I'll be able to get back over to Dolphin Island soon and enjoy the beach and the ocean. So I definitely miss it being quarantined at home.
I think we all do. Thank you, Kristine.
Right. Bye.
Bye, guys.